Hello, and welcome to the dark room, the place where the shadows come to life and the things that go bump in the night are all too real. Today I'll be your guide through the twisted and terrifying stories that we have in store for you. From spine-chilling urban legends to bone-chilling ghost stories, we'll explore the darkest corners of the human psyche and leave you trembling in fear. So, turn off the lights, grab a blanket, and get ready to enter the dark room. The Disappearance of Harry, a haunted hostel tale. Harry had never been away from home before. He had always lived with his parents and had never spent a single night in a hostel. But now, at the age of 14, he was starting in a new school that was far away from home. His parents had enrolled him in the school hostel, and Harry was feeling a little nervous as he walked into his new room. The hostel was an old building, with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper. Harry's room was small and sparsely furnished, with just a bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. Harry had unpacked his bags and was lying on his bed, feeling a little lonely and homesick. He had just started to doze off when he heard a strange noise. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere outside the room. Harry sat up in bed, his heart racing. He listened carefully, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway outside his room. Harry got out of bed and tiptoed to the door. He pressed his ear against it and listened. The growling was louder now, and he could hear something scratching at the door. Harry's heart was pounding in his chest, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. Harry stood frozen, listening for any other sounds, but all was quiet now. Harry breathed a sigh of relief and went back to bed. He was probably just imagining things, he told himself. But Harry couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. He lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the silence. And then, he heard something else. It was a faint whispering, coming from somewhere in the room. Harry sat up in bed and looked around. He couldn't see anything, but the whispering was getting louder. It sounded like there were several voices, whispering in unison. Harry felt a chill run down his spine. This was definitely not his imagination. The whispering grew louder, and Harry could make out some of the words. They were speaking in a language he didn't understand. Harry tried to ignore them, but he couldn't. The whispering was getting louder and louder, and Harry felt like he was going to go mad. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Harry sat in silence, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. He lay back down on his bed, his heart racing. He had never been so scared in his life. Just as he was starting to doze off again, Harry heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking very slowly. Harry sat up in bed, listening. The footsteps stopped outside his door. Harry felt like his heart was going to jump out of his chest. He heard a low growling again, followed by scratching at the door. Harry got out of bed and backed away from the door. He felt like he was trapped. And then, suddenly, the door burst open. Harry screamed as a dark figure loomed in the doorway. It was a tall, shadowy figure, with glowing red eyes. Harry tried to run, but he stumbled and fell to the ground. The figure stepped closer to Harry, and Harry could see that it was wearing a cloak. The figure leaned down and whispered in Harry's ear. It was speaking in the same language that he had heard before. Harry couldn't understand what it was saying, but he knew that it was something terrible. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Harry sat on the ground, gasping for breath. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Harry didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He lay on his bed, shivering and sweating, replaying the events of the evening in his mind. He had never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but he couldn't deny what he had just experienced. The next day, Harry tried to put the previous night's events behind him. He attended his classes, made some new friends, and even participated in some extracurricular activities, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching him. As the day turned into night, Harry felt his anxiety building. He didn't want to spend another night in the hostel, but he didn't have any other option. He reluctantly made his way back to his room and settled in for the night. But just as he was starting to doze off, he heard the whispering again. It was louder this time, and he could hear the words more clearly. They were saying his name. Harry. Harry. Come with us, Harry. Harry tried to block out the voices, but they kept getting louder and more insistent. And then he heard the footsteps again. They were getting closer and closer to his door. Harry felt like he was going to pass out from fear. He was about to get up and run out of the room when the door burst open again. This time, there were two figures standing in the doorway. They were both tall and shadowy, with glowing red eyes. Harry couldn't see their faces, but he could feel their malevolent energy. They walked slowly towards him, and Harry backed away, trying to find a way out. But the figures were too quick for him. They grabbed him and pulled him towards the window. Harry struggled and kicked, but he couldn't break free from their grip. They pushed him out of the window, and Harry fell towards the ground. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the impact. But when he opened them again, he was floating in midair. He looked down and saw that he was hovering several feet above the ground. The figures were still holding onto him, but they had now taken on a different appearance. They were no longer shadowy and indistinct. Instead, they were clear and distinct. Harry could see that they were both wearing cloaks, and their faces were twisted into grotesque grins. They spoke to him again, their voices filled with malice. Welcome to our world, Harry. You belong to us now. Harry tried to scream, but he couldn't make a sound. The figures carried him away into the darkness, and Harry knew that he would never be able to escape them. The next morning, the school authorities found Harry's room empty. His belongings were still there, but there was no sign of Harry. The police were called, and an extensive search was carried out, but no trace of Harry was ever found. Some say that Harry was kidnapped or ran away, but others believe that he was taken by the dark entities that haunted the school hostel. No one knows for sure what happened to him, but the memory of his first night in the hostel still sends shivers down the spines of those who knew him. Years passed, but the legend of Harry's disappearance still haunted the school hostel. Many students claimed to have seen strange shadows and heard eerie whispers in the middle of the night, and some even reported seeing the same figures that took Harry. One student, named David, was particularly intrigued by the story. He had heard about Harry's disappearance before coming to the hostel, and he had always been fascinated by the supernatural. He wanted to know what had really happened to Harry, and if the dark entities were still present in the hostel. David spent his first night in the hostel cautiously, but he didn't experience anything out of the ordinary. However, on the second night, he was awakened by a whispering voice. David. David. Come with us, David. David recognized the voice as the same one that had called out to Harry. He sat up in bed, trying to see where the voice was coming from, but there was no one there. He tried to calm himself down and tell himself that it was just his imagination, but then he heard the footsteps. They were the same heavy, lumbering footsteps that had preceded Harry's disappearance. David knew that he had to do something. He couldn't let the same fate befall him as Harry. He got out of bed and started to look for a way out of the room. But just as he was about to reach the door, it slammed shut in his face. David was trapped. He could hear the footsteps getting closer and closer to his bed. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. And then he saw them. The figures that had taken Harry were standing in front of him. They were just as terrifying as he had imagined them to be. Their faces were twisted into demonic grins, and their eyes glowed red in the darkness. David tried to fight them off, but it was no use. They were too strong for him. They carried him out of the room and into the darkness of the night. David never returned to the hostel. His disappearance was just as mysterious as Harry's. Some say that he was taken by the dark entities that haunted the hostel, while others believe that he ran away. But those who knew David believed that he had gone in search of the truth about Harry's disappearance, and had paid the ultimate price for his curiosity. Years later, the hostel was shut down, and the buildings were abandoned, but locals claimed that they could still hear the whispering voices and see the shadows of the figures that had taken Harry and David. The legend of the haunted school hostel lived on, a chilling reminder of the dark forces that lurked in the shadows.